welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In the previous lectures, we talked about the Articles of Confederation and the weaknesses of the Confederation government, which mandated a new form of government. In this lecture and the ones that follow, we're going to talk about the process whereby we created the Constitution that evolves into the government that you and I still live under today. So we're going to begin by talking about the Constitutional Convention. As described in the previous lectures, it was clear by 1787 that the Articles of Confederation were not a sufficient form of government to govern the states and what was becoming the new nation. And so in 1787 in Philadelphia, many of the greatest minds in America gathered to discuss revising the Articles of Confederation and the old government. They quickly realized that the Articles were simply insufficient and a whole new government would need to be drawn up. As George Washington said, "Experience has taught us that men will not adopt and carry into execution measures the best calculated for their own good without the intervention of a coercive power." And so, over the next 4 months in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, these great minds debated and discussed all manner of different options for a new form of government, ultimately arriving at what became the Constitution. Before discussing the specific debates and arguments about what would become the Constitution, I want to talk a little bit about what the colonists felt about government heading into this debate and where some of their ideas came from. So first of all, when we think about the idea of independence, let's just think back over the origins of the colonies and remember that they were all governed under the crown. They served at the pleasure of the crown and they were begun as charters from the crown. At the same time, remember we talked about an idea known as benign neglect or salutary neglect, which reflected in some ways the relative unimportance of the colonies compared to many of the other British colonies, and the great distance between the colonies and the British government back in England required that the colonies develop some sense of independence. So even while they were colonies, they began to develop a sense of independence because they were so far away from British rule. We can also think a little bit about the origin of a number of these colonies established by people who were seeking religious freedom, which in another sense is a sort of independence. They were trying to break free from the restrictions of the church or other bodies back in their homelands and seeking a kind of religious independence. So on both scores, the colonies really developed thoughts about independence even before they declared the revolution. Equality is another essential idea that goes into the development of the Constitution. And again, there was much discussion about equality long before there was any thought even of a revolution or a constitution. Richard Hooker, who was an English theorist writing back in the 16th century, who wrote on the laws of ecclesiastical polity, developed ideas about independence, and those were echoed later by John Locke, who we've already discussed a little bit. One of the most important writers in the minds of the founding fathers. John Locke wrote about natural law, in which he argued that human nature was already equipped by God to recognize the very laws of nature that governed societies, and all human beings shared this understanding, the ultimate authority of which is reason itself, which all people possess equally. So again, ideas of equality are firmly rooted in the minds of the framers before they even begin this discussion. Similarly, ideas related to democracy and the idea of self-governance evolved long before the revolution itself. In some ways, the colonists looked to England for a model in this regard. Back in the English Revolution of the mid-1600s, Parliament wrote, "We, the Lords and Commons in Parliament assembled, finding ourselves engaged in a necessity to take up arms, do now think fit to give this account unto the world." And then they list their grievances against the king. This language is very closely echoed in the Declaration of Independence itself. And then, similarly, the ideas of the right of the governed to rise up against their government when needed um, had a long foundation in many other documents. One of the most kind of novel ideas developed in the Constitution is the idea of bringing all the states together in one union. But even an idea like this, that was somewhat radical, had a long history going far back into the early history of the colonies. As early as the mid 1600s, there was some discussion about bringing the colonies together. And then we talked a little bit earlier about the Albany Plan developed by Benjamin Franklin and others around the time of the French and Indian War. So these ideas themselves had a lengthy history. And we're going to be talking towards the end of this chapter about the Bill of Rights, which is added on as amendments to the Constitution. But even the Bill of Rights have a background. We can look back to the Glorious Revolution in England back in the late 1600s, when citizens declared their rights to petition the king, barring the king from having a standing army, guaranteeing the right to bear arms, guaranteeing free elections, and others. And so a lot of these ideas are going to be reflected in the American Bill of Rights, which is drawn up at the end of this process. And finally, we're going to talk about ideas related to opposition to monarchy. We're going to be talking about Alexander Hamilton's ideas about the presidency, for instance, and thinking about whether we want to replicate something like a monarch of England. And obviously, our governance system and the presidency is quite different from a monarchy. Again, John Locke provided some foundation in this in his work Two Treatises of Civil Government back in 1690. Locke said, "It is very clear that God, as King David says, has given the earth to the children of men, given it to mankind in common." And Jonathan Mayhew, in his Discourses in 1750, wrote, "What unprejudiced man can think that God made all to be thus subservient to the lawless pleasure and frenzy of one, so that it shall always be a sin to resist him?" And I think there are some similar arguments made in Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which we've already talked about. There's something just sort of nonsensical in all of humanity being ruled by one person. And when we look back on this process, there's also something that just seems almost inevitable, given the growth of the colonies, that they would ultimately forge their independence from Britain, which was becoming a smaller entity than the colonies themselves. And if we look at these figures and think about the population in the colonies, Jamestown originates with about 210, Plymouth somewhere around 2,500 in 1630. But then we see as the decades go by 1650, the population in the colonies is about 28,000. By 1690, 214,000. By 1750, 1.2 million. And by 1780, 2.8 million. And again, we underscore this idea by thinking about Thomas Paine's famous quote from Common Sense: "There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." So let's think about who these men were that gathered in Philadelphia in 1787. And of course, we should note they were all men, 55 men, including many of the towering figures in early American history: Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest delegate at age 81, George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. We should note that a few other prominent figures were not there, like John Adams, who was in Britain at the time, and Thomas Jefferson, who was in France. But again, an assemblage of many of the most prominent figures in the colonies. These were well-educated men. They were schooled in the age of reason and had closely studied the classics. James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution, was particularly highly educated. He had studied and become an expert on the failed republics in particular. He wanted to know what had not worked previously. Most of these delegates could read in the original Greek or Latin. Many of them were fluent in French. Others could read German or Hebrew. These are extremely intelligent and well-educated men. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, he becomes perhaps the most prominent figure in the Constitutional Convention. He, in many ways, is the secretary. He takes copious notes, and he puts full trust in human reason. He's very reasoned and makes sound arguments. We're going to see this again in the Federalist Papers a bit later on. And just to mention a couple of the other prominent figures in this convention, George Washington was elected president of the convention, and there was no other figure in that era who was treated with such awe as George Washington. He had certainly the serious mind and temper to govern over a proceedings like this. And I also want to mention one other, it's perhaps a bit of an indulgence, but one of my own ancestors, John Witherspoon, who was the president of Princeton University and a master of the Scottish Enlightenment. He ultimately was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and his influence was strongly felt in these proceedings. He had been a teacher of many of the delegates, including James Madison, and ultimately numbered among his students 9 cabinet officials, 21 senators, a dozen state senators, and 3 Supreme Court justices. And so his teachings were actually very significant in the mindset that carried the day in that room. And they were based on moral, political, and human sciences, and the kind of realistic comprehension of human nature. So just as a final note, let me underscore once again that these are men in the sense that they are real people. You know, in our minds they have become literal figures either on a Mount Rushmore or statues or something like that. But these were real men. They were complex. They were imperfect, as much of our modern debate in this country has pointed out. They had flaws and did some things wrong. And yet they all carried into this convention a seriousness of purpose, a willingness to discuss, debate, listen, learn, and compromise. And we have to appreciate the fact that they did not insist on being right about everything. Although, as I've mentioned, they were all highly educated. They were used to being right about most things. But they were willing to concede that in the interest of coming up with some plan that will work for all of us, they might have to give a bit here and there on some of the details. As South Carolina's Pierce Butler said early on, "We must follow the example of Solon, who gave the Athenians not the best government he could devise, but the best they would receive." And so again, the outcome of this convention, the Constitution, didn't necessarily have to be perfect in every way, but it had to be something that was good enough that would be accepted by the bulk of the American people.